Yeah, Linda, it's not just the tote bags, the radio station t-shirts, the public radio mugs. It's like almost like an art installation of public radio call letters. Linda and I have so much in common. Also, Don, I think, listening to Don this morning and getting to know him on several conference calls ahead of this event, we have a lot in common. I mean, he teaches African Studies and African History. That was actually my undergraduate major at Wesleyan, that and European history. I want to thank you for inviting me to this gathering. I don't know about you. I wasn't here last night. The plane was late. But even from this morning, I'm already energized by, I got 27% more of me than I would have had, having been inspired by some of the examples of people doing the most important work being done in this country we've already seen this morning. And it's like, what, 10 o'clock in the morning? We got a lot more to go. I want to thank Don, Secretary Riley, the Riley Institute at Furman, and the other professionals at the Institute who obviously know what they are doing. I always come to South Carolina when I want to have good, clean fun. I've ridden bicycle down to Myrtle Beach a few times in the summer. And for wintertime fun in South Carolina, I find visiting the city of Columbia during any presidential primary season always a barrel of laughs. I was there covering the 2008 primaries for public television. Your politicians can be, well, you play for keeps over there, don't you? Full contact politics. Whenever I share a tech innovation that I've come across in my newsroom, my daughter Maddie likes to say, "We live in the future." We live in the future. True story. Last month was the deadline to submit your applications to NASA if you're interested in setting up a mining operation on the moon. Wow. We live in the future. There's a report that Apple's fancy wrist, true story. Last watch, you probably heard about that, Apple's fancy wristwatch might contain sensors that give an early indication that you might soon have a heart attack and warn you in advance. We live in the future. Just did this story this week. Boeing, the aircraft maker and defense contractor, is working on a smartphone that is super secure. So secure that if somebody messes with it, it self-destructs, like on Mission Impossible. But even as we live in the future, we sometimes live in the 19th century, or as Don was pointing out, the 18th century sometimes. True story. New York police the other night arrested 70 people in a sophisticated rooster-fighting gambling league. Actually, there was one 21st century feature about that story. Some of the birds had been given performance-enhancing drugs. Maybe the truth is, I think, that only some of us live in the grand future. Don mentioned the census data about South Carolina. In September, right about the same moment you were digesting the statewide numbers, I was doing a story using Census Bureau data that found that 46 million Americans live in poverty in the United States, and that household income was down even as supposedly the economy was recovering. That is, we noted that this was the official poverty figure that doesn't include things like, well, government benefits might mitigate that. Maybe we should also factor in costs of living in different parts of the country. When you do that, the Census Bureau a couple of months later in the year, came out with an alternative measure of poverty. Maybe that would be better. Turned out, no. The new count, it was even worse. The alternate one showed not 46, but nearly 50 million Americans living in poverty under that measure. More than 16% of Americans instead of 15%. More people are living in poverty in the United States right now than at any time in my lifetime. And I'm like a half century old. It's unbelievable. But it is believable if you spend any time out in the real world. Figures like that don't sound like any kind of a future to me. So we don't all live in the future, do we? Now, technology can address some very important human needs. It's not all words with friends or paying real money to mess with fake digital fruit on screen. Those people are making a fortune, by the way. It can address real human needs. For instance, I'm doing more reporting. It's an exciting project. There is a smart engineer who's figured out that while getting hearing aids to low-income people in Brazil and Africa was a challenge in itself, but they're making some inroads with that challenge. Perhaps the bigger challenge, he noticed, was the cost of the battery for the hearing aid every couple of weeks. That is a challenge. He figured out how to construct, using his engineering skills, cheap rechargeable hearing aid system. Uses in part solar power. You buy one, it lasts 3 or 4 years, this battery. People can hear, people can be more productive. Technology does solve so many problems. But so far there's no app that narrows the yawning gap between rich and poor in America. There is no app that narrows the achievement gap in our schools. However, there are some other innovations I would like to briefly highlight for you this morning that I wouldn't label as technological achievements per se, but they are, this is the key, they are innovations and achievements nonetheless. These are helping to build stronger local and stronger regional economies. I'm going to share 3 with you from 3 cities, not all that far away in the United States. But before I get to them, I want to mention the origins of my interest in the health of local communities. I come from a town that you might even recognize because you have them here in South Carolina. I come from a mill town in the state of Maine that had 2 dominant industries growing up. Had the Kimberly-Clark paper plant and the famous Hathaway shirt factory, the dress shirt factory. Remember the Hathaway shirt man with the eye patch in the ads? Both of those plants are on the banks of the Kennebec River up in Maine. Now, when you go to my hometown of Waterville, Maine, the factories are still there, but they are shut down and the jobs are long gone. I went to public high school in Waterville, and they did set me up for what I needed. They gave me what I needed. I had some wonderful teachers, but no one mentioned the word globalization. No one mentioned terms like technological unemployment. Now, we get a little tourism from the Belgrade Lakes. That's just down the road from my town. If you ever saw the movie with Jane Fonda on Golden Pond, those are our lakes. We have Colby College up on the hill, but my town needs work, like so many of our towns and cities. Now, the stock market, as measured by the S&P 500, Don gave the Dow just now, so I'll give you the S&P 500, has gone up, I did the math a day and a half ago, up 176% since the nadir, since the trough, March 9th, 2009. In the last 5 years, it's gone up 176%. But somehow, as we know in this room, this has gone right past so many of our cities and towns. Which is one of the reasons I made this movie. It came out a summer ago. It's called Fixing the Future. I set out from my hometown, that mill town, and went from Main Street to Main Street across America looking for something better ideas for our economy. Didn't seem quite right to go to Washington looking for solutions. Remember, I started this project about 3.5, 4 years ago. It didn't seem right to go to Wall Street looking for solutions at that particular moment in history. Not saying Wall Street is not an engine of innovation from time to time, but it was when weapons of financial destruction were in the headlines every day, and it didn't seem the first place I should start. So I went to Main Street, and it was not hard to find fascinating projects. My search for main streets with bright economic ideas took me, for instance, to an enlightened bank, an enlightened financial institution in the Midwest that is partly employee-owned, but it is for-profit and gives all those profits back to the community in the form of philanthropic grants. It's called the Bremer Bank. Amazing history. It was this enlightened German-American who, during the collapse of the financial markets in the 1930s, had gone from prairie town to prairie town trying to keep people liquid. And for complicated tax reasons late in life, it made sense to him to set up the structure of Bremer as essentially a charitable foundation. It's, by the way, the only bricks and mortar banking presence at the Minnesota State Fair. If you want to, go to a real ATM or something, or get a loan with your cotton candy in your hand, you can go to Bremer. I also went to Bellingham, Washington, where the CEO of a factory figured out that if he invested in some robots, often seen as taking away jobs from we flesh and blood humans, but in the case of Bellingham, Washington, he invested in robots so that he could hire more local people, instead of sending work to places in Asia. I looked at an alternative currency in Baltimore, and we explored a wonderful, I like to call these social capital generation devices. Social capital, that amazing resource, perhaps the most important resource, when people get out of their houses and come together to think about the future, think about working together. Oh, wait. This conference is one giant social capital generation device. It definitely is. One of the most effectively organized ones I have ever seen. But let me tell you about this social capital generation device called a time bank. It lets people swap skills. All of us have something that we do quite well. You could make soup. Maybe you're a doctor, physical therapist. Whatever they're good at, they can swap them. It's banked by the hour, not by the dollar. At the moment, the IRS has ruled it's not taxable. Barter is, right? If you put a trailer hitch, if you offer that in swap for a pair of snow tires, that's in theory a taxable transaction, but not at the moment if you swap by the hour. Those are known as friendly favors under apparently an interpretation in a tax court. Now, what am I good at? I'm not quite sure, but I'm all right with tools. And so I helped weatherize the basement of a woman named London up in Maine. I put in an hour to do that, squirted in some insulation, put in some weather stripping, fixed a door that was hanging open. I put that into the time bank. What did I get back? What I got back was pretty good. It was an hour sailing lesson on a beautiful Atlantic Ocean bay on a gorgeous day. So in the title of this presentation here, I have promised a tale of 3 cities. And as it happens, all of these cities begin with the letter C. So let's take a trip on the high seas, starting with C for Cleveland, Ohio. This is a tale of how clever thinking and clever partnerships, it's the key word of what I'm about to talk to you about, partnerships. This is a tale of how clever thinking and clever partnerships is bringing hope and jobs to inner city Cleveland. I want to tell you about an outfit called the Evergreen Laundry in Cleveland. It's an industrial laundry that uses some of the most environmentally friendly processes available in the U.S. today. That is crucial, but that is not all of it. It's co-op. Evergreen is owned by its own employees, who are people from the surrounding inner city neighborhood, a very distressed inner city neighborhood. For every hour they work, of course, they are paid, but a piece of that hour is essentially banked with this co-op as a kind of stock, a piece of ownership stake in the company. The employees are all owners of what is therefore a co-op. And here's how it works. And all of my examples, by the way, you're going to say to yourself, oh, we're already doing that in parts of South Carolina. Or you're going to go, oh, we're already doing that better in parts of South Carolina. Or perhaps you'll say, that's a good idea. I wonder if we can do a version of that in South Carolina. So I'm going to offer them to you in that spirit, and you can pick and choose. But here's how it works with the Evergreen Laundry in Cleveland. They did an inventory in that city of who are the big remaining players in Cleveland. Who are the big players who are not going anywhere? Well, there's a bunch. Maybe the Rock and Roll Museum, but also University Hospital, also Cleveland Clinic. And they ask themselves, what are the major items that these big players spend money on? What are the big budget lines? One plump, juicy budget line they discovered for the hospitals: laundry, industrial laundry. At the time, one of the hospitals was spending money by writing checks to a multinational company that did the laundry somewhere else, not Cleveland. What if that budget line could be run through a green, that is innovative, environmentally low-impact laundry company that they might set up, and then that budget line would get magically converted into paychecks for people living in downtown Cleveland? An area that, if time did not forget, then the job market had long forgotten. Let's take a look at our first clip from Cleveland.
Cities have populations of people locked in the inner city who are locked in generational poverty, generation after generation. They simply can't get out.
The strategy here is to find a way to tap into the big budgets of some of the major institutions in the city.
The big three anchors in Cleveland, the clinic, university hospitals, and Case Western, together purchase over $3 billion of goods and services, and very little of that currently is sourced locally. They're the legacy of the manufacturing strength of Cleveland a few decades ago or 50 years ago, and they're the kind of businesses that don't get up and move.
The co-ops are pressing these institutions to shift business toward them, so the money turns into local inner-city jobs.
It's extremely heartening to see how these large institutions, which aren't going anywhere, have come to the realization that their fate is bound up in the fate of the community, that they're not islands unto themselves, that if they're going to grow and succeed in their own business model, the community needs to succeed as well. So they've been extremely forthcoming and supportive of this strategy.
The bet is when Evergreen got started, we're going to fail because of who they hire. And our bet is we're going to succeed because of who we hire. When you hire people this is their last chance of being, having a productive future or really doing something for their children or themselves, those people's backs are to the wall. So they know, hey, I can't mess this up, And that's what we're betting on, That's what we're betting.
That charismatic guy is Medrick Addison, one of the managers of Evergreen. I've spent some time with him. Medrick will be the first to tell you the Evergreen story is not one of these great men of history, great women of history tales. It's not about Mr. Addison himself, hero though he is. I'm a bit of a collector of African proverbs, having spent time living in West Africa and East Africa over the years. Here's just one. Maybe you've heard it. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. In Cleveland, this neighborhood-changing effort is not just about one person, but about partnerships, a coalition of interests coming together to get this project done. The Cleveland Foundation puts in some of the money to get this Evergreen Laundry up on its feet. These anchor institutions had to play along. The hospitals themselves, Case Western Reserve and the Cleveland city government are supportive. And then the talents of the people who live in the area are brought to bear to fertilize or nurture this big idea. There's now in Cleveland also Evergreen Energy Solutions doing solar with a neighborhood workforce, and green city growers with local greenhouses making food using a similar model. Plump, juicy budget lines turned into good jobs. All right, back to the high seas. Interstate 71 to the south and west of Cleveland. For not quite 4 hours, you get to the second of our sea cities, Cincinnati. If Cleveland was about partnerships and entrepreneurship, in Cincinnati we find it's a partnership involving education. A school in an extremely disadvantaged part of Cincinnati. The neighborhood in question is called Lower Price Hill. Lower Price Hill. Mostly white, extremely poor. The official designation is urban Appalachian. Many people whose fathers and forefathers worked in the coal mines, then those jobs went away. This is where we find a K-12 community learning center in the Lower Price neighborhood called the Oyler School, O-Y-L-E-R. If you were writing the recent history of this school using the great person theory of history, you would center the story on a hero named Craig Hockenberry. He's the principal of Oyler, and some say it's heart and soul. Now that neighborhood brings with it some challenges, some big ones. One day a parent was shot to death across the street from the school not long ago. My colleague on the radio at Marketplace, Amy Scott, has been profiling Oyler over the course of an entire year. Hockenberry, the principal, told Amy that he could walk her 15 feet down the street from the school, and there are parents engaged in, he said, prostitution and are hooked on crack. Parents, the principals said, who used to be on his PTA. So challenges. But good things are happening at Hockenberry's school. There's been a $21 million renovation of the physical plant there. High schoolers take for instance, I love this, we profiled it on the radio, Steps for Success is what the class is called, where they go as a field trip en masse to a fancy restaurant downtown in Cincinnati, no jeans, no hats, no heels allowed, and learn to comport themselves properly in a business lunch setting. One of the teachers, Riley, remarked to us that this is done in baby steps. One kid stuck his fork into an entire chicken at the fancy restaurant, was eating the whole chicken. But they had a discussion. More importantly, Oyler has an on-site medical clinic that can do regular medical checkups. It offers regular vision care on-site and can order students free eyeglasses on-site. A van with a dentist comes regularly. A psychiatrist is on-site daycare for students. It's not a school. It's a community learning center. And ready for this? In the past 3 years, more students have graduated from high school than have graduated from that neighborhood during the previous 85 years combined. Can I say that again? In the past 3 years, more young people have graduated high school from that lower price neighborhood than all the kids that have ever graduated from high school in that neighborhood since the year of 1929. Now, this achievement would not have been possible without the efforts of the principal and a dedicated team of teachers. Experts say you can have all the on-site services you want, and that alone won't fix an otherwise failing school. But what my reporter Amy has been telling me, and she's also working on a feature-length documentary about the Oyler School, a film, what she says makes this project possible are these partnerships, a combined effort from a coalition of stakeholders, like we saw in Cleveland, starting with the Supreme Court in the state of Ohio that ruled in the late 1990s that schools like Oyler were unconstitutionally awful. The Adopt a Class Foundation is involved in what's going on at Oyler, the YMCA, Cincinnati Children's Hospital. They've got a credit union involved. The Media Corporation, E.W. Scripps, is in there. The coalition goes wider, so you get this. This is not about Oyler's wonderful principal, Craig Hockenberry, the lone wolf. It's about a partnership. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. 9 hours, dead east of Cincinnati, we find the third city with a C. It's Camden, New Jersey, just across the river from Philadelphia, while my colleague Amy Scott's been doing the Oyler School for Marketplace. My healthcare reporter, Dan Gorenstein, has been watching Camden over the long term. Journalism doesn't do enough of the longitudinal work, and we're giving it a try here on Marketplace. Camden is a city that has endured, frankly, a sometimes notorious reputation for urban blight and corruption. If you saw one of the movies up for an Oscar tomorrow night, American Hustle, you will have seen hints of a few of the real-life shenanigans perpetrated by elected officials in Camden over the years. Jeremy Renner plays kind of a character that you feel affection for. If you do a little reading in history, the actual guy will earn less of your affection. Among Camden's assets are its waterfront that faces Philly. Another asset is the big corporation in town, has pledged now to stick around. It's Campbell Soup Company, we all know them. But one of the real engines of economic development in what is still a city with many challenges is healthcare. We had entrepreneurship in Cleveland. We had a little example of education in Cincinnati. Let's talk about healthcare. EDS and meds, really. EDS, educational institutions, and meds, the medical care industry. There's a great set of hospitals there, and they're actually getting more of them as we speak, it seems, affiliated with institutions of higher learning in the Camden area. There's a new $139 million Cooper Medical School of Rowan University, plus there's Cooper University Hospital, part of Rowan. And most recently, they've just opened a $100 million MD Anderson Cancer Center at Cooper. MD Anderson, you may know from Austin, Texas, is one of the premier cancer centers really on earth. They chose Camden. But here's the thing. At a time that the healthcare landscape, of course, is changing with federal reforms, Camden has found itself at the center of a grand experiment, one that could bring benefits to some of its most disadvantaged residents, even as the project attracts top talent to the area in this subject of medicine and healthcare policy. Now, if we were going to write this story according to the great person theory of history, we could focus on a guy named Jeffrey Brenner. He's a doctor, at times a somewhat grumpy doctor, and he started out very frustrated by crime in Camden, so he began putting little dots, on maps of Camden to identify hot spots of criminal activity. Where were the crime clusters, and would that help allocate resources more rationally to deal with the crime? So where's he going to get the data for the maps? So he was able to persuade the local hospitals to give him data about emergency room visits, appropriately stripped of identifying information to safeguard patient confidentiality. Well, turns out medical information was more interesting. The data that he got about healthcare was perhaps even more interesting than what he originally sought about crime. Dr. Brenner soon noticed that most of the medical expenses in all of Camden came from certain concentrated areas, hotspots. It turns out that lots of people, because they have no insurance, no transportation, few support systems, a few people were going to the hospital all the time. All the time. One guy, 113 times in a year. For colds, asthma, feeling dizzy. You'd go to the hospital if you have no other recourse. You ran out of medicine. Data show that 1% of the Camden population was responsible for 30% of all the costs. So what did Brenner's team do? Accent on the team. And most importantly, what did they do that is accruing to the health of Camden as a whole, the health of their citizens, but the health of the community more widely? What they did was they developed a system to exchange healthcare data on patients citywide every single morning. They send teams directly to the hospital bedside when someone comes in. Later they go, these teams, to a person's home and then with them to doctor's appointments. They make sure people get access to their medicine and to their rehab. Doesn't that seem expensive? Dr. Brenner asked me to think about how the regular medical system works. This is what he told me, quote, American healthcare gets paid for filling the beds, not for emptying them. So ultimately, keeping people healthy, he said, there's no business model for that. He went on to tell us, if you were listening to Marketplace that morning, that he won the MacArthur. You heard him say, we, meaning the traditional medical system, are very good at cutting, scanning, zapping, but we don't talk to people. We don't coordinate their care. They get lost in the healthcare system. So, Brenner et al. Coordinated, and this approach was responsible for, I'm glad you're sitting down, a 56% decline in hospital admissions of the people in the program. 56% cut it more in half. Cut hospital admissions more in half. I mean, it's striking. The work attracted additional money. The federal government awarded $17 million in grants to expand this to all of Camden and also to bring it to other cities. People from around the country, just as they're visiting the Euler School in Cincinnati, are now going to Camden to watch and to learn. Camden, New Jersey Healthcare Laboratory. Dr. Brenner himself, in recent months, indeed won that MacArthur. But he is the first to say that the genius is not him. The genius is the coalition that came together, the partnership. Now, of course, just briefly, an aside, we do need to watch and learn experiments like this. I was reading that there's a little provision of the Affordable Care Act that you may not have noticed. It dings hospitals a certain amount of Medicare money if people are still sick after the treatment and have to go back to the hospital. Taking care of the grassroots to include preventative care may become more widespread, if only because of that. But in the case of Camden, they've become a laboratory in the best possible sense to work with this stuff. I want to quote from a pal of mine. His name is Andrew Zolli. He's a card-carrying futurist, and he's co-author of a book called Resilience. Resilience, Why Things Bounce Back is the book. And in it, he and a co-author look at animals, ecosystems, tech systems, with a view to lessons about what we can do for our communities and organizations. It's a book about how people, communities, companies, ecosystems can thrive amid disruption. Challenges, sometimes unexpected, come at us regularly. That's not going to change. Hurricane Katrina, right? Superstorm Sandy. I remember what Hurricane Hugo did in this region. The lesson from the natural world is that often successful, resilient systems, Zolli found, the lesson is that they're not perfectly efficient, and they're sometimes messy, as partnerships can be, but resilient systems are very efficient at perpetual adaptation. Zolli writes, there are no finish lines here, no silver bullets. I'm reminded of the time I went to New Orleans, and there was a fundraiser for the local public radio station. A local lawyer had recently purchased an antebellum fancy house that was in a terrible state of disrepair. They were working on it. It was kind of cool having the event there. The rafters were visible, the studs. It was going to be a while. And I said, when are you going to finish this? What's the time frame? And boy, wasn't that the wrong question. Never. This is an ongoing process. We'll be doing this for the rest of our lives. Resilience must be continuously refreshed and committed to, because in Zolli's book he says there's no single recipe for every circumstance. We must instead look to, he writes, redesign our institutions, embolden our communities, encourage innovation and experimentation, and support our people in ways that'll help them be prepared to cope with surprises and disruptions, even as we work to fend off the disruptions. Resilience, Zolli says, and here's the key word again for us. I said it'd be partnerships. I also used the word coalitions. There's another one. Resilience is enhanced by the right kind of clustering, bringing resources into close proximity with one another. It's a special kind of clustering, he writes, one whose hallmark is density and diversity of talent, resources, tools, models, ideas. He says it's that kind of diverse, dense clustering that led to California's Silicon Valley and leads to the successful living on of an old growth forest. Now, before I go, well, I'm not going to go. We're going to do a Q&A here. But before we transition to that, one last city with a C. I thought the guy said he was only going to be 3. Well, I got another one. I love this one, so let's toss it in. And it turns out it's a city that begins with a C. We looked at community building from in the film, In Fixing the Future. We had a moment where we looked at a community building activity that started with the planting of a community garden, something as simple as that, in Chester, Pennsylvania. Chester is a town with much poverty. It's a town where if you're going to try to buy a fresh vegetable, the nearest place to do so is in the next state. It's a food desert. We're going to hear more about that this afternoon. You have them here, unfortunately. Chester is where Dr. King attended seminary, When I arrived there for Fixing the Future with the crew, the town was forging a fascinating coalition to marry together the idea of time banking, we talked about that, with setting up this community garden, swapping of skills, and working on a joint project. A local policeman was helping lead the charge, partnered with students from Swarthmore College. The Chester Housing Authority was in there. And the effects of the garden and soon the time bank were already beginning to bear fruit when I visited. Let's go to that clip. What do you like about it?
I like that it's a community garden, that's for the community, and it teaches the kids how to eat better. Most of them have never had anything that's in this garden before.
If you want to buy food to cook in this here,
You got to go to Aston or Brookhaven.
how far away?
6 miles about.
So there's no grocery store.
Nope, the next grocery store will be in Delaware. There's no grocery store in the city of Chester.
It's in the next state.
Yes.
It's unbelievable. So no wonder you need a garden. I mean, you know. So you ever cook up this stuff at home?
And that's the cool thing with starting this. It's a neighborhood initiative.
Wait, what happened? You got a bug? What is that? But you think something this size can make a difference to a community?
In this community, yes.
Talk about the garden.
Yeah.
I mean, they would like to have it bigger. There's a lot of stuff they would like to do with it.
We want to see good things happen in our community. You know, things are growing.
Yeah.
You know.
Jesse Marshall and a team of students from Swarthmore College just up the road partnered with the Chester Housing Authority to get the garden off the ground.
We're in a really extraordinary position here in Chester where there is no source of fresh produce, and that is a travesty and a tragedy, but it's also an incredible opportunity. It's hard, learn a lot of roots. Wow, look at that. So what this allows us to do is do it ourselves and create jobs, create income, improve health, build community with public spaces like this.
The Chester Housing Authority also plans to incorporate our exchange into the garden and into other programs like computer training, where kids get skills that could lead to a job.
You can look around and see like how we're trying to make a change one step at a time. So I guess it depends on the person who's trying to lead. So I think that's one thing we've been learning about lately.
I want to like build schools and give back to my community and bring more to Chester, like be a place where people can go and hang out and have fun.
They say the children are our future. And if we don't help them, what's going to become of their future? I wonder about that all the time. That's why I need 20 more years in my life, because I got to make sure when my grandchildren grow up that they're not going to have all this hardship in their life. In the city of Chester trying to start this time bank, I think it will be good for a lot of people, because a lot of people can't find work. If they just start doing some of this volunteer, who knows, you might stumble upon a job in the midst of it all.
If you're ever stuck at home during the next ice storm, you can actually download Fixing the Future from any cable companies. A shortened version is on iTunes if you care. But there is another way to think about all of this as I conclude. I'm not sure I would recommend it, but there's a completely other way to think about some of this. I got to thinking about the other approach to some of these issues. I found them in the writings of Isaac Asimov in the second of his famous Robot series. The first one is I, Robot. Everybody's seen that one. Second one is Naked Sun from 1955. He envisions a future in which the fancy people, some might call them the 1%ers these days, had simply left the planet Earth and set up their own new pristine planet where everything was in order, everything was clean, and technology did all the work. Asimov writes science fiction, you say? Well, Asimov first put forth the idea of geosynchronous satellites, the foundations of modern global communication, so he's got some ideas. But as we reported on Marketplace earlier this month, there is a movement based in Northern California called the Seasteading Institute. Their idea is to build new cities out to sea, beyond the long arm of government regulation. These new communities would experiment with social organizations and legal systems and compete against each other for seasteaders. It's got about 1,800 people who've signed up already. Again, far-fetched. Their idea is to start small, to get a friendly country to let them dock a big ship in a protected harbor, but agree to let the ship rule itself, like some kind of free trade zone or tax-free zone on steroids. Now, that is one way forward, and it is in the tradition of isolated American utopian communities. Or we can acknowledge that there is work to do here on land, and if we break down barriers, seek clever partnerships, clusters of innovation, think in fresh ways about our challenges, as we are doing here during this weekend, we might be able to bring the future to our communities here at home. We'll hear some of the examples of what's going on here in South Carolina a little bit more later this afternoon. Thank you very much.